Both were sophomore albums. They followed up not only their debut, but also an EP. They were critically acclaimed. They were commercial breakthroughs and pushed the bands to a completely different level. We will compare Ænima and the Downward Spiral on this episode, talking about records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local, but you are in the U.S., you can shop online anytime at ntxvinyl.com for new, pre-order, and reissued records. Of course, you can shop locally if you're here in the Dallas area, and would love it if you'd subscribe on our YouTube channel. Follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at NTX Vinyl is the handle. Let's talk about two of what I consider to be the most important, the best albums from the 90s. If you get into the rock metal scene, Ænima from Tool, the Downward Spiral by 9 Inch Nails. These are, in my opinion, absolute masterpieces. And if I was going to rank the top, 10 albums from the 90s in the rock genre, these would certainly be near the top of that list. They may even be near the top of that list for me holistically as far as rock and metal is concerned. 94, March 8th of 94 is when the Downward Spiral comes out. 2 years later, Ænima comes out. So timing-wise, these did not line up perfectly, and I realize that. But there are a lot of other commonalities between them, and that's what excites me to kind of compare and contrast the albums. When I think about these albums, first let's look at the timeline in the discography. So if you take 9 Inch Nails first, obviously huge breakthrough with Pretty Hate Machine. Massive response, commercial breakthrough with Head Like a Hole, Down in It, huge singles. Then they followed it up with Broken. Trent did, of course, which was also pretty popular. A great EP, which featured some really prominent growth, I think. Coming from Pretty Hate Machine to Broken, you can hear a lot of growth in Trent's songwriting and the instrumentation and in my opinion, the aggression, right? The Downward Spiral follows that, right? So it's hard to talk about the importance of this record in their career, but so that comes third. Now, if you compare that to Tool's, a little different, but they started out with an EP. So you start out with Opiate, if I put it the right direction. Then they followed up again with their breakthrough, Undertow, huge singles like Prison Sex and Sober. So again, I don't think quite the radio play and mainstream exposure that Pretty Hate Machine had with a song like Head Like a Hole, but pretty big exposure when you think about what videos like Prison Sex and Sober did on MTV. Big breakthrough for the band as far as putting them on the map, allowing them to tour. And then of course you have Ænima after that. So those align pretty closely. Again, it's interesting that they both had the kind of EP in there. In Tool's case, it came prior to the debut record, and 9 Inch Nails, it came after. Downward Spiral, March 8th, 1994, peaked at number 2 on Billboard. Huge singles. March of the Pigs was the first single and was my first impression, like most people's. If you think back to the MTV era, and you think back to where you're going to discover new music, 120 Minutes was a show that aired a lot of bands like this, alternative bands. And that initial video for March of the Pigs was an eye-opener. It was just the band live on like a white sound stage, tons of fishnet and goth going on, and just wrecking the keyboards. Closer was obviously the song that really hit big for the Downward Spiral, and then you also had Piggy was a single as well. So just 3 singles off off of the Downward Spiral. It's gone on to sell, it's 4X platinum. It was produced by Trent, of course, as well as Flood and Alan Moulder on the mixing side. Ænima released in 96, September 17th in 96, originally on vinyl, which is this copy right here. I'm just still overjoyed that I actually own that, believe it or not. But 3 times platinum, peaked at #1. Singles, the first single was Stinkfist. H was a single, and the title track was a single. If I'm going to compare the singles on these albums, again, both had kind of three singles, one of them being huge. I think it's hard to tell on Ænima if Stinkfist or the title track was the bigger single. I kind of feel like Stinkfist was, because it was the lead single, whereas on the Downward Spiral, it was more about Closer coming out. March of the Pigs was almost kind of the pre-single, and then Closer was what really kind of blew it up. Let's talk about videos. I talked about March of the Pigs. When you get into Closer, that was a groundbreaking video, and I would compare it more than March of the Pigs to what Tool had going on with Ænima, because if you think back to mainly the videos for Stinkfest and Ænima, I don't know if there was a video for H. I don't believe there was. But Stinkfest and Ænima, those videos, which followed in the footsteps of Prison Sex and Sober, with the claymation, the caricatures, the really eerie and creepy visualizations that Adam Jones from the band kind of brings to the table from his history in cinema, that type of thing. So I think if you're going to talk about videos, Ænima kind of has a leg up there, although the Closer video is very, very dark and very, very iconic. So both just visually captivating when it came to the era of videos. So now, as far as album artwork, man, album artwork's tough too. 2 very, very iconic albums. This is the definitive version, reissue of the Downward Spiral. Also have an original promo copy, which I'll talk to you about. But this is some of, I think, the most eye-catching artwork in Nine Inch Nails' catalog, and just in general from 90s rock albums. Very, very stark, very rustic. It's almost as if it's falling apart in front of you, which aligns so closely to the music. I forget the guy's name who did the artwork. It's in here in the liner notes, but man, it's beautiful. It's beautiful and it's ugly all at once, which is perfect for an album like the Downward Spiral. So I really appreciate what these bands put into it from an artwork perspective. It's not only about the music. It's not only about the studio album. It's not only about the live show. It is the complete package, and that's why these bands, I think, stand the test of time. I think these are timeless albums when you look at the music and you look at the visuals, you look at the amount of creativity that was put into them. So I love the Downward Spiral. Now, Ænima, again, just very, very eye-catching. I'd never seen anything like this. I mean, you don't even know how to really describe it. The CD was a lenticular CD, so when you kind of moved it, it would animate a little bit. Obviously, they didn't replicate that on the LP, but you've got a ton of equally as dark, equally as sinister artwork. Actually, some band photos from the studio, which is unlike Tool to include anything that has band photos on there. The very iconic kind of eye, this dude, and then of course you've got the tribute to the late great Bill Hicks, which the entire album is dedicated to. So, it's hard. If I was gonna compare album artwork, I would probably go with the Downward Spiral. Although this image right here is pretty iconic in regards to Tool in general. So there's a lot of goodness again visually when it comes to these bands, and they take such care in creating an aesthetic for each of their albums, and I think that translates a lot to the live shows as well. They take everything they do very seriously, starting with the music and run it all the way through from an artwork and the live presentation. So I really appreciate that. touring, let's talk a little bit about touring before I get into the nitty gritty of some of the album stuff. One of the reasons that these two albums in particular stood out to me, and I kind of compare and contrast them in my head, is because I saw the bands, both of the bands, multiple times on the tours for these albums. So Nine Inch Nails, first off, I missed their first show through Dallas on the Downward Spiral tour, and I regret that. I was at a smaller venue called the Bomb Factory, which has been reopened and is a great room. It's just an empty room, only holds maybe 3,000. I regret not seeing that show, but I did catch them. That was in May of '94, not long after the release, right? Just a couple months later. They came back through Dallas in October of '94, and I did catch that show. That was at the Fair Park Coliseum, which is not a huge venue. I'm making this up, but I bet it doesn't even hold 3,000-4,000 people. They hold like old rodeos there and stuff in Dallas, down in the Fair Park downtown area. They came back just a few months later. That was October of '94. They came back just 4 months later in February of '95, played the same venue, Fair Park Coliseum, and that's the show. I don't know why they chose Dallas, but that's a show where they recorded the video for Hurt. If you remember the video for Hurt, very, very chilling video. It's essentially a live recording of the show where they have a screen that comes down in front of Trent, and tons of visuals representative of the artwork are on the screens. Super iconic video. So it was shot at Fair Park Coliseum, but it wasn't the show I was at. It was just 4 months later they came back. Then followed that up, getting into later in '95, October of '95, they came back and played the amphitheater in Dallas with David Bowie, which was absolutely phenomenal. Not only was it, Nine Inch Nails opening, but then Bowie and his band came out and they performed the tracks Reptile and Hurt with Bowie. So I got to see the band twice during the Downward Spiral period, which I will always cherish. Now, Tool, I saw even more times than that on the Ænima tour. So I saw every show that they played in Dallas, which was 3, and then also saw them in Austin and near San Antonio. So November of '96, March of '97, 2 shows, and then August of '97 on Lollapalooza, which was fantastic, and then August of '98 back at that same venue, Fair Park Coliseum. So I saw Nine Inch Nails and Tool at the same venue, 2 of the same venues, which was Fair Park Coliseum in Dallas, as well as what is commonly known as Starplex, the amphitheater in Dallas. So again, a lot of commonalities for me personally seeing these bands. And this is when, 94, I'm 16 years old. 96, I'm 18 years old. So you can imagine at just the period in my life when you're just consuming media and consuming music, and I'm living off of it at this point. I just started playing guitar right in that period when I was around 15 or 16, so I could pick up a guitar right now and play you riffs off of both of these albums, tons of these songs. I couldn't play the whole songs, I don't remember all of them, but I remember main riffs, especially when it comes to Tool, because it's such a riff-heavy format of rock, right? So let's talk about that. As far as instrumentation, 2 very, very different styles of albums. Tool is very much a band, meaning you've got 4 guys who all bring their style, who all bring their expertise, and believe me, they are experts. They bring that to the table, and Ænima is a great example of that. You can listen to demos of the Ænima tracks, and they're fully formed. And in interviews with the producer, David Bottrill, he talks about how the first time he heard Ænima, the demo version of it, like, again, the songs were all there, the melodies were all there, drums, guitars, all of the parts were all built, right? Totally different from Trent and the Downward Spiral, where Trent, David Bottrill and Tool recorded in LA, but Trent, also in that area, they recorded the Downward Spiral, he and, Flood and Alan Moulder, at the Manson Sharon Tate house, which is just so damn creepy, right? So if you're in a place in your life like it appears Trent was, where he's ready to go down that spiral, I guess you could say, what better place to rent to record in, where a bunch of murders took place. So a very eerie thought and you can imagine what he was going through at the time when he took that upon himself. They also recorded Broken was recorded there as well, and one of the first Manson records I think was recorded there as well. And then the place was tore down after that. But so again, back to the instrumentation. Tool, all four players bring it to the table. Nine Inch Nails is Trent. Downward Spiral is Trent. He's got credits for essentially all of the writing and the performing, not everything, but the vast, vast majority of it. In fact, I didn't even know Trent actually played the drums on Piggy, which is an incredible drum part. So there's just a huge juxtaposition in regards to style as far as performance in the studio, two completely different types of bands. One of the things that struck me back to Ænima when I was listening to the interview with David Petrell, the producer, like one of the things that surprised me the most is he said not only on this album but also the Salival record as well as Lateralis, which he produced, that the band doesn't use a click track. Didn't use a click track on Ænima, which if you're not a musician, that probably doesn't mean very much. If you are a musician, that should drop your jaw. It did for me. With music as technical, as detailed, and as precise as Tool on an album like Ænima, to not have a guide to play to be able to punch back in, to be able to edit, that's very, very impressive. The fact that they can pull that off, and it just speaks to how tight of a unit they are. And again, going back to that interview with Petrell, he just talks about how, you're not going to find better musicians in the world than the guys in Tool. They all are experts at their craft and at their instrument, and I believe it. They've got to be, in order to play this type of music without any sort of click, which is unbelievable. Production-wise, it's a toss-up. They're both really beautiful produced albums. They both sound excellent on vinyl. I mentioned that this was the definitive version of Downward Spiral. I'll also have the 1995 promotional copy, which I bought in store. I'll never forget, and I've told this story before, but I bought this album at a little record store here in the Dallas area, and I remember walking into the record store, and it was a pretty new place. I hadn't been there before. I think I only went there a couple times. The first time I was there, this was playing, and I didn't quite know it yet because it had just come out. Again, this is a promotional copy, and I remember the eeriness of the store because there was a couple of TVs in the store, old school, big box TVs, and they had VHS tapes playing of the David Koresh kind of Waco cult disaster that happened. So it was just like, I was like, why is this on the TV? And then this was playing over the speakers, but it wasn't March of the Pigs, which was the only song I'd heard at that point, because again, that was the first single. But I thought, man, this has got to be the Nine Inch Nails record, because I could tell Trent's voice, of course. Talked to the guy behind the counter, and he sold me a promo copy, which I still have, which I really appreciate. Production-wise, just fantastic, and again, sound great on vinyl. This one's much, much harder to get on vinyl. Again, that's an original pressing. I also have a bootleg pressing, if you will, which is on orange vinyl. These come in all different kinds of shapes, shapes and colors, essentially. And because Tool and vinyl, it's a whole thing. Like you can't really get into that topic without getting frustrated. Nobody knows why an album like Ænima or their next album, 10,000 Days, has never been pressed to vinyl. Tool's only been pressed originally when it came out. I'm sorry, Ænima, and then 10,000 Days has never had a pressing. There are legalities at play in regards to that and why it has taken so long. Hopefully that all gets resolved. Luckily, on Trent's side, he's already got a hold of his catalog and has reissued the definitive versions of the entire catalog, including Downward Spiral. So that one is accessible, thankfully. The other thing I just remembered is Ænima, when it came out in 96, so it came out on vinyl September 17th. I unfortunately didn't get my copy then. I don't even remember knowing about that at the time. Like 2 weeks later, 2-3 weeks later, it comes out in CD. I was there when it came out on CD. And one of the things, at least for me, it was at Best Buy, you got this promotional item This is a 4-track picture disc single, and it features Stinkfist, the lead-off track, obviously, from Ænima, as well as Opiate, the title track from the EP, and then it has Prison Sex and Sober on it. So a little 4-side picture disc. Mine's got a little warp to it. I haven't played this thing in years, but this was a freebie that was given out when you bought the CD at Best Buy, and I remember buying it on release day, again early October of '96. So that's a really cool piece in my collection. As far as the track lists are concerned, I talked about the singles already. I think you would have to, I don't know, you've got Stinkfist, Ænima, and then you've got March of the Pigs, Closer. That's an even Steven tie right there. Deep Tracks is where it really gets into it. If you look at the Downward Spiral, some of my favorite deep tracks would be Reptile. I mentioned being able to see that live with David Bowie. Incredible. Also, you had Hurt. Hurt was a massive song and obviously went on to be covered by Johnny Cash as a really iconic moment. But the deep tracks of Reptile, I Do Not Want This, The Becoming, Heresy, Mr. Self-Destruct. Man, the picture that the Downward Spiral paints is an incredible one. It's a dark one, and unfortunately, in a lot of ways kind of mirrored what Trent was going through at the time, at least from afar it does, because he was deep into addiction, into probably depression, and trying to deal with mass stardom, right? Because he was at that point very, very recognizable, not only in the music scene, but again, in the mid-90s when the alternative took over the mainstream. Like, he was not as famous as someone like a Kurt Cobain or an Eddie Vedder necessarily, but very, very famous and recognizable, especially because of the MTV play, which is where a lot of, rock stars from that era became known, right? Now, the deep tracks on Ænima, you had Stinkfist and Ænima as singles, as well as H46 and 2 was a big single. It still gets a lot of play to this day. Third Eye is a track that has always stood out to me. It closes the album. Let's talk about closers. What's a better closer, Third Eye or Hurt? Man, that's really hard. Two totally different songs, obviously. Push It is a fantastic deep track that went on to be re-released, a live version on the Salival EP that Tool did after Ænima, which is fantastic. Then you got really heavy hitters like Hooker with a Penis, and the track Eulogy, which I absolutely love. So great singles, great deep tracks. That's the thing about both these. I think if I was going to say what's most similar, it's not really the sound, because they're two very different sounding records. Tool's very much an aggressive guitar and drum oriented rock metal album, right? Whereas Downward Spiral obviously has a lot of industrial components, feeding into it from Trent's earlier kind of new wave industrial Pretty Hate Machine era. But they're both albums. They've got a concept running through and through, which is incredible and engaging, and it pulls you in. And again, I think they're meant to be listened to front to back. So singles are great. I could point out deep cuts, but really these are spins from start to finish, and that's the way I think were meant to be heard, and that's the way, in my opinion, that they're heard the best. I talked about the concept a little bit. For each of the concepts on each of those. You obviously have threads running through the Downward Spiral, which I mentioned, around the story of someone really going off the rails. Whereas on Ænima, you've got stories around, title track with California falling off the face of the earth. You've got a, song like Hooker with a Penis I mentioned, which is, there's so much irony and satire in Tool's music, and to some extent humor. And that's kind of who Maynard is, and he's gone on to do that for their entire career. As serious as their music is, as heavy and weighted as Tool's music is and as Ænima is, there's always a hint of like, I don't know if they're laughing with us, but maybe laughing at us. That's what I feel with Maynard. And then they go, the album's dedicated to Bill Hicks, who was a comedian, a fantastic comedian, who had very similar ideals and spoke in his sets about topics like religion and politics and sex and all those types of things that Tool translates into their music as well. So that was what seems like an odd pairing for Tool to be so for this album to be ingrained with a comedian who passed away. But looking back on it in hindsight, now knowing the arc of who Tool is and who Bill Hicks was, it makes total sense. Critically, I mean, I think the Downward Spiral was a bigger album. I mentioned sales, so it's 4 times platinum versus 3 times platinum, and I think a lot of that again is the song "Closer," which to this day is still a staple, and also "Hurt." Those songs were just huge. The singles on Ænima were big at the time, but I don't think are still played as much on alternative or active rock radio or streaming devices and all those things. I didn't look up streaming numbers. I don't really have access to all that, but. Yeah, so I think there are tons of parallels. Now, if you're going to ask me, and I know you are, if you're going to ask me to choose between these 2 albums, this is the thing. If I can only choose one album to listen to the rest of my life, and I can't listen to the other one, like that's the trick here. It's not just choosing one. It's choosing one and then pushing the other one out to where you can't ever choose it. I would probably go with the Downward Spiral. And that's incredibly hard because I love Ænima. Again, I saw the band 5 times on the Ænima tour, so I have incredible memories of seeing these songs live on all fronts. But to me, the Downward Spiral, and then going into the Fragile, because I love the Fragile too, this is just peak Trent. The amount of attitude and texture and the unique nature of the Downward Spiral, I think stands alone amongst 90s albums. I just can't think of a better piece of art than the Downward Spiral. I love Ænima as well. Not putting it down one bit. It is a fantastic piece of music as well, through and through. So hard. Both are so great. Both were so impactful on my life, and I still gravitate towards them and listen to them often, which is the whole key here. Like, they have aged so well. These albums could have been released in 2023 and sound just as good from a musicianship, writing, production, pressing, everything across the board. Just 2 fantastic pieces of work that are very hard to compare against each other. But again, so many commonalities that it felt natural to pit these 2 up against each other because, again, they're both sophomore releases. They both were preceded by a big debut as well as an EP. And so even though they didn't align and come out at the exact year, 94 versus 96, that era of music, for me personally, again, when I was 16, 18 years old, seeing these bands on these tours just made such a huge impact. So it brings me joy to continue to listen to these albums and enjoy these albums and reminisce about these albums. And that, for me, is what this video series is all about. So thanks for watching. I would love to hear your choice. If you could only pick one, are you going Downward Spiral or are you going Ænima? Let me know in the comments. We'll talk to you guys again soon. My name is G.I. Sanders, and this has been Talking About Records.